Okay, good morning, everyone. Shall we begin?
Yes.
Shall we begin? I don't know who's here and who isn't here, but let's get started. I'm just switching to gallery view. Okay. So I think yeah, I can see the first message there. So good morning. I say good morning, also good day, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, wherever you are. And hi, Marian.
Very much morning for me.
Very much morning for you.
Good morning at 5 a.m. from the East Coast.
Okay, so today we're going to be discussing this rather wonderful book called The Disappearing L by Bonnie Morris. So I'm going to begin, if I may, just by giving a quick introduction to the author, Bonnie Morris, who is a lesbian historian and a historian particularly of women's history more broadly and lesbian history and culture more specifically. She's probably best known for her work on, sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of, okay. She's probably, as Marian disappeared, she's probably best known for her work on women's music festivals. And for this book in particular, Eden Built by Eve, a history of women's music festivals in I think mainly in the United States. And also a lot of that work is captured in this book, The Disappearing L, that we're going to be talking about, subtitled The Erasure of Lesbian Spaces and Culture. But she's also done a lot of important work in the fields of the wider women's music scene, women's sports, Jewish women's history. She's published a total of, I think, 13 or possibly by now 14 books. She taught for many years at Georgetown University in DC, and is now based in California, where she's engaged in archiving a lot of the material from the women's music movement, and also in teaching. She's a frequent guest speaker in various academic, institutional, and other kinds of settings. For example, in 2023, she's going to be a guest speaker for the 50th anniversary of the lesbian Olivia Cruises. If you'd like to find out more about her, she's got a website, bonniejmorris.com, and she's also got a number of talks on YouTube. She has a new book coming out, I think next spring, on the history of women's sports, called What's the Score? And she also, I only discovered this yesterday, her most recent book that I'm not sure if it came out last year or earlier this year, it was it's a poetry collection called Earlier Households, and it looks a really beautiful book. I should just mention that I did actually email Bonnie yesterday just to tell her that we were doing this webinar, and she asked me to convey her warm regards to everybody. She said that she was honoured that we were going to be discussing the book. She says that she stands by what she's written, and she also mentioned that the Disappearing L was awarded honours by the American Library Association. So it's actually reached quite an astonishingly wide range of readers, which is, given the nature of the topic, it's really important and really fantastic that she's managed to do that. So that's a little bit about the author. And now I think, Marian, you're going to give us a brief introduction to the book and a kind of general overview of the content.
Yeah, I mean, this book, I think followed, I'm not sure if there was one in between, Eden Built by Eve's. Bonnie Morris is just a superb historian and archivist. And the book, Eden Built by Eve's, is basically a history of women's music festival, an archive of it. And she's just spectacular what she has put together. And then this book follows on the heels of that. This was published in 2016, The Disappearing L, Erasure of Lesbian Spaces and Culture. why do we care about this? I mean, this is, you know, lesbians are a 2%, you know, of the population. Why do we care about the disappearing L? Why do we care about the erasure of lesbians and lesbian spaces? And we care, I mean, we care because we care about the elimination of any culture and ultimately the people in any marginalized minority. So that's one reason to care about it. We care for the same reasons that we care about when this happens to other marginalized minorities. And this book happens to be about one marginalized minority in particular, lesbians, published in 2016. And things have gotten, if anything, worse, far worse for lesbians since 2016. I'm glad to hear her say she's, you know, stands by her work. She does use LGBT when referring to community and organizations, occasionally uses the word queer, but uses lesbian to refer to individual women and to the history of lesbian culture. And that is kind of an extraordinary thing, since, you know, so many lesbians get referred to as just queer women or LGBT women. So she, for her to have done that, to even use the word lesbian now is like an unusual, almost extraordinary thing. And she initially talks about like how lesbians used to find ourselves, and then other lesbians before there was much community and when community was just beginning. You know, this is all pre-internet. I came out in 1969, and all the older women there talked about trying to find themselves. And she recalls furtively looking through everything in the library, and which is, I think, something we can identify with. You know, you'd go to the library and just like sit in the stacks and not actually check out any of the books, so nobody could see what you were reading, and try to recognize yourself in things you were reading. And then she moves to the women's movement and what a difference that made. I mean, there was political action by all women for, you know, for equal opportunities, equal pay, equal rights, childcare, sex-specific rights and services like abortion, rape counseling, domestic violence shelters, things that were used, nearly all were used almost exclusively by heterosexual women. But lesbians worked hard for all that, including all the stuff that we knew we'd probably never need. But there was a desire through all this, when women found out, you know, when they were working together, that that there was something about places to be separate from men, which was particularly sought after by lesbians, so that women, especially lesbians, made separate spaces as refuge and sanctuary within the wider world, spaces for political action, but also having found out that there was just something about spaces that were for ourselves that was extraordinary in a way that being out in the rest of the world wasn't. And then she talks about women's music festivals as brief periods of complete separatism, which they are, with Mishfest really kind of being the archetype, starting with women's music in the early 1970s, which was just first played in any venue that could be found. But these music festivals gave the new women's music places to be heard. Refuge, sanctuary, I'm not alone, safety. And she talks about, or she quotes the reasons for separate spaces. A concert. This concert is for women only. It is important that you understand why. Women must have an opportunity to come together to develop our culture as part of the process of taking control of our lives. For women who have been raped, beaten, deserted, fired, misled, manipulated, discriminated against, had their children taken away, the man at the concert may trigger pain, even if he is the nicest guy in the world. Men can offer support by staying away and encouraging other men not to go. That has now become, you can't say that anymore publicly, because you get canceled, you could lose your job and things like that. So there's this just thing that women discovered about being in these temporary all women, primarily lesbian communities at music festivals. Why was that important? What did we find out? I mean, Julia, what I found out, you know, my first Mishfest in 1977, what I found out was like I could walk in the dark, you know, alone at night, and I was safe. I found out that things worked differently, even in a simple thing like being online for meals. I found out that things work differently, even in just setting up your tent. So there were reasons for these separate spaces, but then levels of separatism. Do you want to talk about that for a while? Because I think separatism is different for straight women and different for lesbians, and it makes a difference for lesbians in terms of, you know, disappearing us, whether or not we have separate spaces and the degree to which we have those separate spaces.
I mean, maybe I'd just like to go back a little bit, because in the first chapter, even before she really starts talking about the development of the festivals, she talks about the establishment of the women's music scene in itself, and the festivals kind of growing out of that, because once you started to have, you know, these small local concerts, maybe like in a church hall or, you know, some kind of community venue. And I found it really, really moving, you know, the way she talked about how important, as you were saying, how important those spaces were for lesbians to find each other at that point, given that homosexuality was illegal, given that, you know, you could be, you know, cast out from your family, lose your job, lose your children, you know, the really terrible kind of closeted and very precarious nature of life for lesbians at that time. I remember there's one section where she talks about just this, you know, women saying this amazing feeling of looking around the room in a hall and feeling there are other lesbians around, apart from, you know, me and my maybe half a dozen friends that I have. There's a room full of 100, and I just found that so powerful and so moving. And I love the way that she kind of then traces that trajectory from, you know, the fact that it created venues and spaces for women to write, to perform, then with the development of Olivia Records to produce the records, to have these locally based concerts, and then to develop the, you know, the bigger scale festivals, and how many of those that, you know, there were over the sort of 1970s and 80s in particular. So I just think that's really fantastic, the way that she kind of shows that development. And I think it really conveys, as you were sort of starting to say there, Marian, just how crucial, and I know particularly in the US context, just how crucial those spaces were for lesbian survival, and even beginning to do more than survive, but to actually thrive. And I think that's something that struck me, thinking about the kind of dominant focus of activism, say in the UK at the moment, in terms of the you know, the resistance against, you know, transgenderism and, you know, gender identity, etc. There tends to be quite a focus, I would say, really very much from a heterosexual woman's perspective, on women-only spaces, that focuses on things like, you know, bathrooms, toilets, changing rooms, women's refuges, women's, you know, women in prisons, all really important. But I think women-only space obviously has a completely different meaning for lesbians. Yeah. When it is, yeah, our space, it's our lives, it's where our, you know, where it's, you know, where we create women-only spaces, perhaps lesbian-only space, but other broader women-only spaces. It's where we can begin to thrive, where we can begin to form relationships, community, friendships, politics, culture, all of that. And that there isn't really so much focus on that, I think, in this country at the current time, because the sort of what we could say is the gender critical movement is pretty much a fairly sort of like heterosexual perspective, I think, in that. And I think she's Bonnie Morris has just done such a great service in her, and I'd like to say a little bit about her methodology maybe later on, but the huge, I mean, just the huge amount of work, really a lifetime's work, that she's put into documenting and archiving this culture. I think it's phenomenal, and it really kind of, you know, it really reminded me of the depth of that culture, which is in very serious danger of being, you know, being completely erased, being villainized, not just erased, but actually thoroughly villainized as well. But so yeah, I don't know, what do you think about that, Marian?
I think that people don't realize the extent to which it's happening. And when I think about what Bonnie Morris has done I think about those Smithsonian historians and archivists keeping alive cultures that are on the verge of dying. I think people don't realize what it was like, and I think she makes reference to this when I went to see Meg Christian in a little, church. I think it was a church basement or something, singing, or a club, and singing songs about where she would change the lyrics. They were love lyrics from a man to a woman, but she would change the lyrics around. And I mean, who does that anymore? I mean, nobody was doing it then, but to hear like a love song from a woman to another woman, it's, if you're not part of, if you hear love songs your entire life that talk about the way you love, most women being straight, and then all of a sudden hear the way, you're this minority, this on the verge of of being erased, hearing a love song from a woman to another woman, that was huge. I mean, that was incredible. That was like going to the Smithsonian archives and hearing the music of my dying culture. Because even when it was at its height, it was still like this, like, kind of protected area, it felt like, with the world around us. And we were, I was aware at the time of feeling like this is something really special. We have to protect this. And it seemed like it would go on forever. So yeah, the spaces really, really are different. And it's not, it's not just like, you go to your women's club for whatever you want to do, women's bowling league, women's tennis, women's knitting club, women's cooking circle, and then go home to your husband. It's like, no, I mean, lesbian spaces, you go there to meet potentially the woman that you're gonna eventually go home to. And it's an entirely different worldview. And it's really kind of like being one of those cultures that if we don't keep it alive, it could really die out. But I mean, lesbians will be lesbians, and there's always going to be women who are attracted to other women.
But I think there's a huge difference, isn't there, if you have a culture where that can thrive,
Yes.
because it's not
Yep.
something that's static. It's if a culture is thoroughly kind of suppressed, marginalized and erased, then you're really just about in survival mode. Whereas when you can actually create those spaces, and this is one of the things I think is so good about her work, that she really focuses on the physical spaces and the importance of those, and the physical artifacts, all of those kinds of things. That's where you actually can begin to thrive. And also it changes the parameters of what is possible. Things become possible when you've got this wider community, when you can develop politics, when you can develop language. It just expands the whole kind of reach of what is possible. And that's one of the things that I think she captures really, really beautifully in the book.
It's threatening though to the wider culture for us to do that. I mean, all those things that we work for politically, domestic violence shelters, all those things, the one of the end products of all those things was that it enabled women to leave men, to walk away from them, to be independent of them. And that I mean, there were men, kind of, they could turn it to their purposes to some extent, but lesbians, especially in a separate lesbian community, even for 1 week in the summer, that was like a real threat. That wasn't just like, walking away and then, having visitation rights. That was women who were completely inaccessible to men. And that is a scary thing to men in patriarchy. It's a scary thing to some women also.
I think, one of the things where she's talking about, obviously the whole focus of the book is on trying to document the culture, the women's music culture in particular that she's talking about, but also other aspects of lesbian culture, particularly the sort of the literary aspects, like the publishing of books and booksellers, and all of that kind of thing. And then she has a specific focus in one of the chapters on Jewish creation of specifically Jewish lesbian culture. But one of the things that struck me, where she's talking about the erasure of the women's music culture, is I suppose now in recent years we've come to associate that obviously primarily with the transgender assault on women and assault on lesbian spaces in particular, and we can maybe come on and talk about the absolute viciousness of that, and the for me what is a very, very clear and unequivocal patriarchal assault on women's culture. But what I found really interesting and really made a lot of sense to me and was very important about the first couple of chapters is where she talks about the erasure of the women's music scene kind of almost as it was happening, and in ways that definitely preceded the transgender onslaught, which I guess we would associate really from the kind of mid-90s, 1994, with Camp Trans onwards to the really absolutely disgusting attacks on the festivals in the women's spaces. But I thought it was interesting when she was talking about basically how the development of that women's music scene had, which was in many ways specifically a lesbian music scene, had pretty much either been ignored or then sort of deliberately erased, to the extent she was talking about it kind of from the early 1970s onwards. So by the time you get to the late 90s, the music festivals had started, I think, around about 1971. I think Mishfest started about 1976. These had all been going for about 20 years. And then she talks in the second chapter, I think, about the Lilith Festival, which was then greeted as the first women's music festival ever, and completely erasing like the past 20 years. And she talks about why that was, and also the phenomenon of kind of like the women's punk scene and riot girls, these kind of music music phenomena or music trends that were seen as this very new thing of women for the first time, setting up bands. And she said, she asked the question, like, why were these taken up by the mainstream music press? Why were they kind of more palatable? And I thought it was very interesting that she identifies not just the sexism, but also the specific anti-lesbianism and also the ageism of the earlier women's music scene being written out, because she said that a lot of the musicians or those who were involved in it were lesbians who were coming out slightly later in life, maybe had already been married to men, maybe already had children. So a lot of them were mothers and kind of older women. They weren't this sort of section, they obviously rejected all the beauty practices and objectification. So when this new kind of post-punk riot girl kind of, whoever they were, I can't remember now the different names, Bikini Kill and some of these bands started to come through, although some of them might have embraced a bit of a queer identity, basically they were kind of more palatable, they were more objectified in various ways and heterosexual, and also younger. They were in their 20s rather than their 30s. And so I thought that was a really important sort of tracing of the simultaneous erasure of that women's music scene, even kind of as it was happening, way before we get to all the very, very targeted, willful attempts at erasure by the transgender activists.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of infestation of mainstream, of male values, of male socialization, male sexuality started very, very early. I mean, I grew up in a time and a place where there were really specific, separate and very coherent but separate gay male and lesbian communities, and straight men would wander into the gay male communities, sometimes ostensibly straight men, and want to have sex the way gay men were having sex. There was no emotional connection. It was, as much sex as you could have every single day. I mean, there was no expectation of affection. It was just, and straight men wanted women to have sex the way gay men were having sex, and lesbians were the polar opposites, and straight women who were exposed to lesbian community wished that they could have sex with straight men the way lesbians were having it with each other. And then that was just sort of extrapolated and generalized to all sorts of like male socialized values, so that male socialization, male socialized sexuality, male values. T. Grace Atkinson has called it like a male culture. That's I've heard that term used by a number of other writers as well. But that was there long before, even at the height of lesbian community in the 70s and early 80s. So that when we got to the 90s, the things that were important to men and to male socialization and male sexuality had already permeated lesbian culture. That's where SM came from. That was before BDSM. That's where SM came from, and that that's when there started to be a sort of this gulf between old school lesbian and new school lesbian, and the old school wasn't that much earlier. I mean, I'm old enough to have been old school, but so it was not so much. It was that lesbians. I mean, Bonnie talks about assimilation eventually, but it was partially also male culture, male values, male socialization, male sexuality, patriarchy infiltrating and kind of, I think, facilitating that assimilation. Part of the assimilation as well was all those older women, and I was one of them. Eventually, just we thought the community would always be there. We pursued careers. We pursued coupledom, in the suburbs with other couples as friends. The white picket friends. We're tired of the activism, wanted to get on with our lives, and thought that the culture and the community would always be there. And one of my greatest regrets is that we all did that. I feel really terrible about that happened, and that it wasn't there for young lesbians, because when they came along in the 90s, I was in the middle of, my partner and I were sort of in the middle of like whole career stuff, and we thought about going back to the fest, which we hadn't been to in a while, and then just saw it's just like, it's all this BDSM, there's there's all this, there's all that, do we really want to do that? Because it had changed, and it had changed for a lot of reasons. She spends a long time talking about growing objections to even the temporary all women spaces of music festivals, especially Mishfest, which is I think important because it was mostly lesbian. It was known to be mostly lesbian. I mean, that's where the concept of women born women came from, and I never liked that term because there's no other way to be a woman. And she also talks about the emergence of the term TERF. So why the resentment against lesbians in particular?
Yeah, I think I think that's a really important point you're making there about the sort of shifting culture, because certainly the impression that I have from the way that she traces it in or documents it in her book is that it's really from the kind of mid-90s where you start to see this shift in the culture. And obviously the particular year of 1994, which was the first year that this terrible real assault on the festival started, with Camp Trans setting up like in such an aggressive gesture, setting up directly opposite the festival site. And then actually obviously there was always that phenomenon of the long line of cars and vans and everyone waiting to actually go into the festival, and then these misogynists, I think there's no other word for them, anti-lesbian activists from Camp Trans going along and giving leaflets to those women, trying to encourage them to boycott the festival, and all of this awful stuff. But what she says is that year where they first had this presence of Camp Trans, such a hostile presence opposite the festival, that was only really seen as one of several controversies that were going on. It was also around that time that there was this push to include some kind of space for sadomasochistic practices, even talk of a push to have pornography, and I think even prostitution on the land that actually was resisted. But definitely you start to see, and you can see it obviously completely in parallel with what was going on in the universities at that time. So younger women who were doing gender studies courses or whatever, would have been introduced to this very much more kind of queer, queer masculinized culture and politics, and all those kind of influences about sadomasochism, pornography, prostitution, etc., coming in. And she says at that point, and I think that's really important, that all happened kind of around about the same time as this transgender presence. And she says that at that time, Boo Price would be leaving the festival forever, along with several important workers loyal to her, and the younger working class founder Lisa Vogel would carry on as sole producer. And that, I don't know quite to what extent that that kind of shift in terms of like the
I don't know.
I don't know,
yeah.
but she said that happened that year, and so I don't know if it was maybe an attempt by Lisa Vogel and the other organizers to try to keep the festival going. And given that there was less, there was already quite a rejection of lesbian feminist culture, so maybe to try to make it appealing to some of the younger women, that they then, certainly the impression I had was that they tried to accommodate different needs and then different kind of desires, I suppose you would say, that within the land. And some of those obviously are really, really important, like the Women of Colour 10 and the I don't remember the name of it now, but the accommodation and support for women with various health conditions and disabilities to participate. There were really important accommodations and
12-step recovery,
that kind of thing.
drugs and alcohol.
Those, the substance-free areas, that kind of thing. But also then this kind of I guess like live and let live area with the twilight zone, and that kind of idea will give these women their space there. But it was certainly, I heard some really really awful and disturbing things about that year in particular, in terms of the presence of SM on the land. And to me it just doesn't seem very surprising that happened at the same time there was this Transonslaught, and you really start to then see this kind of clash between the original ethos of the event and this kind of influences, or basically, I don't know, entryism. I think
the Transonslaught is again a male onslaught. I mean, and I had mixed feelings when I heard about those like separate areas. It's like, okay, you want a Women of Color tent? Yes, absolutely. Okay, you want a chem-free, sober space? Yes, absolutely. Okay, you want an S&M tent? Okay. And I mean, do you really have to be on the lunch line with whip marks on your back that are bleeding? Probably not. But on the other hand, is it like, do it in your tent and just so the rest of us don't have to see it? That we can debate about whether or not it should have to be there at all. But the fact is that it came from the male stream. And it kind of goes into, she talks about like, the points of erasure. The first one, she refers to as sexism, but it turns out it's probably more than that, a heavy-handed misogyny.
I think even before because she talks about the points of erasure kind of right at the end, doesn't she, in the final chapter. I just want, if I may, I just want to capture some of because I think we've kind of gone straight to all this kind of pretty grim stuff. I would really, before we look at those points of erasure, and I think there's really interesting things to discuss about what she identifies as those particular points, but I would love to just pay a little bit of attention to both her methodology and also some of the perspectives that she captures from women who attended Mishfest in particular.
I'd like to read some of the stuff.
Shall we read some of those quotes, because I don't want to kind of skip straight to that, because they were so powerful and so moving, and certainly they really resonated with me from my one experience of going to the very last one. So maybe should we read one each, and that will kind of give a flavor.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so there's a couple of the things about women taking their daughters that I thought were absolutely really beautiful and really touching. So one I should just say for listeners, the methodology that which sounds a very dry word, but basically the way in which Bonnie Morris gathers all her data, all her material, is so impressive. She just attended as many of these festivals as she could. She completely immersed herself in the culture. She was writing down as things were happening. She was busily writing things down, and then she realized that was only ever going to be her perspective. So she got in the habit of, then when she was in front of, maybe the night stage, watching a band, she would pass her notebook around for women to write in, with the question of what does festival culture mean to you, and then women would write their thoughts, their feelings, their perspectives into the notebook. And she said it always just somehow or other miraculously got returned to her at the end of the night, and she would have this really rich collection of perspectives. And when she went to the very final one, she said by that stage she was just collecting everything, like sweaty handprints and hummus stains and bits of fern. She was just collecting everything, and so these notebooks are just such a treasure trove. So anyway, here's a couple of quick quotes. I watched my daughter and her girlfriend cuddling together on a blanket at the night stage. The sun was still bright overhead, and I felt such bliss looking at them, to know that my daughter has all this, a place for her. So glad. And the next one after that, my 16-year-old foster daughter has only been with us for 1 month. She threw her hands up to the sky and shouted about how at home she felt. Watching her wearing brightly coloured wings, flitting about, that was my favourite moment. That's just a couple, but I just find these quotes so moving, and they really capture just what an incredible achievement it was that these women were creating this week in the woods. Did you want to read one or two, Marian?
I came to Michigan and my protective shell falls away. My heart opens, I cry as I listen to the love songs and the pain of the women who have struggled to be who they are in a world that is judgmental and harsh. In Michigan, I fall in love with my sweetie, myself, and the land. I see beauty in each woman, and I can breathe again. I don't ever want to go home, because this is home. And the younger women, eventually would say that there was something about like going to a festival and having some 65-year-old lesbian say, "Welcome home." Just nothing like that. When was the last time I did something for the first time? At this festival, I showered with friends in the open while entertained by live music, crowd surfed, made love in the forest, learned about American culture, and worked topless. When I look at the photos of Mishfest, it's like, oh, I'm in there. I'm the one with short hair and no shirt.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, that thing of that whole ethos of creating a home was. I just felt that so powerfully when I went. The very first greeting you have when you arrive and go into that kind of reception tent. I probably had maybe a welcome tent, and then the women there say welcome home, and it really brought to me how important that was. That must have been the very first years where women had often lost their homes, had been thrown out of their homes, and so that creation of a home for that week was such a huge achievement. But anyway, so it's a really, really rich collection of quotes. There's about half a dozen pages of these wonderful quotes, and I think it's fantastic that that Bonnie Morris has just included them and let them speak for themselves. I really feel all the way through in terms of like the ethics of her doing this work and, you know, writing this book and creating these archives, that there was such a kind of integrity about it, that you really feel that she's doing this out of a sense of really wanting to kind of serve the community in which she found herself and which she was a part of, and
it's a calling, or a mission.
Yeah, I think the kind of the ethics of it and the absolute kind of heart and soul, we could say, that you know, comes across, that it really comes across in, you know, everything about the way that she collected all the material, how she treated it. And I remember when I was doing my PhD and I was, you know, documenting anti-pornography activism in this country, and I really remember those kind of ethical dilemmas of being this participant observer. I was so much immersed in the activism myself, but at the same time I was writing about it, and all the kind of ethical dilemmas that throws up. And I really, really admire the way that she's faced all those challenges and done something really, really creative with it, and just done it's made such an amazing contribution. Because if she hadn't archived all this, you know, this really rich material, you know, she's saying that you know, she's fighting against the erasure, and I think she's given it a much greater chance of survival. There's actually, if I may just quote this in terms of that, this at the end of the second chapter, this her final sentence, I think, really, really sums up the work that she was doing, where she's talking about the archiving of Mishfest, and she says, having outlasted nearly all other lesbian institutions, the Michigan Women's Music Festival now balances on slender, sharpened pencils, with many critics bent on its erasure, and archivists like me racing to write down all that ever happened there before it's forgotten. So yeah, that, to me, that really sums up what she's doing. And obviously we have other works. We have you know, Sheila Jeffries, The Lesbian Revolution, and also her autobiography, Trigger Warning. So, you know, there, and I know with Mishfest there are other online archives as well, and, you know, stories from Mishfest. There's been a lot of that kind of archival work that's going on. But Marian, what did you want to say about
it? Really, I mean, it was a calling and a mission. It feels like, and I encourage people, if you haven't read it, besides The Disappearing Elle, to read the one specifically about music festivals, Eden Built by Eves, where it's just, oh my God, it's just going through all this material that she so lovingly collected over all those years. It's just really a remarkable achievement.
There's also this book as well. I don't know if you can see that one, that is specifically about the Michigan Women's Music Festival. It's called The Michigan Women's Music Festival: An Amazon Matrix of Meaning, and it's by Laurie J. Kendall. So there's that one too. That she really focuses a lot, as I recall, on this sort of the creation of home, and how that informed the you know, the kind of ethos of the festival. One of the things I remember with that book, though, I was quite disappointed with, was that I remember there are points in the Laurie J. Kendall book where she's actually quite disparaging of lesbian feminists, which that's one of the things. Seemed to me quite a weird contradiction in terms of the politics of some of this writing, and I did feel that to some extent also with Bonnie Morris's work. So in that section where she talks about the trans issue, as she calls it, and I would call it, you know, the trans attack, transgenderist attack on women's spaces, and in particular she's talking about Mishfest. And the way that the women who were involved in Mishfest, and the way that Bonnie Morris herself talks about that whole kind of episode, is I just found it strange in terms of the language that was used, because she and Lisa Vogel and others are very much defending Mishfairs, they're defending the women's space, they're defending the lesbian spaces. But at the same time, I found the language to be quite sort of capitulating and to the idea of transgenderism as being in any way valid.
It was. I mean, Lisa Vogel repeatedly said the intention of this festival is that it's for, that phrase again, women born women, you know, for actual women. But that they don't check, you know, they don't, they'll sell a ticket to anybody and they don't check genitals or anything else at the gate. So it was more like saying, we really wish that all men, no matter how they identify, would stay away, but we realize we're stuck and we can't keep them out. So what can we do about it? Which was realistic. You know, it might have accelerated things even more in terms of these men being, you know, kind of vicious and aggressive. If she had said very early on, you know, we're drawing a line in the sand, we absolutely don't want you here. Or if she had tried not to sell them tickets, which would have been probably illegal. So I'm not sure what else she could have done, but it is capitulating because there just wasn't anything she could do except to say, could you please respect this? And they're men, so obviously they're not going to respect it.
But I think even more than that. I mean, in some ways you could say, well, that's trying to be a bit pragmatic in this, you know, really, really, you know, impossible situation of this war on women and war on your event. But I also see that in some of the statements that were put out and in some of the language that Bonnie Morris uses, I think and I don't know if this is particularly of its time, but they kind of lend a validity to transgenderism. They fail to name men as men, and okay, maybe that is their attempt to be pragmatic as well. But like, for example, in this quote from Lisa Vogel, she says, I reject the assertion that creating a time and place for women-born women to gather is inherently transphobic. This is a false dichotomy and one that prevents progress and understanding. I believe in the integrity of autonomous space used to gather and celebrate for any group. No one should be asked to erase the need for autonomous spaces to demonstrate that they are sisters in struggle. And I think somewhere else she talks about, you know, that we should be joining against the real enemy, failing, certainly, whether she saw it or not, I don't know, but certainly failing to publicly state or actually show any understanding that transgenderism is the enemy, or like men pretending to be women are the enemy. It's not that we can all have these autonomous spaces and they can have their trans spaces and we can have our women-born women spaces and we're all sisters in struggle. You know, that is obviously a complete failure to recognize that transgenderism is a male assault on women. It's a patriarchal attack on women. And given the viciousness of it, I just find the language, there's lots of places that I highlighted it, I found the language very minimizing. You know, in one breath, you know, Bonnie Morris documents all of these, you know, hideous like calls to burn down the festival, all the attacks, let me see. I mean, all the attacks. And then she just kind of says, oh, this is probably like immature mischief making. Well, I don't think a call to burn down a festival is immature mischief making. It's a very, very serious threat of male violence. So I found the language kind of at odds with what they were actually, with the nature of the situation and, you know, the viciousness of the attacks.
It goes back to when, you know, when she was talking about the points of erasure and calling it sexism, to me, it was more than just sexism, more than just this systematic, you know, it was misogyny. I mean, it was really vicious, savage misogyny. It's, you know, men pretending to be women and wanting to infest and invade women's spaces is misogyny. It's woman hating. And in particular, for a place like Mishfest, it's especially lesbian hating. So it was more than just sexism. Sexism sounds almost genteel, but misogyny is heavy-handed, it's vicious, it's savage, and that's what the enemy does. It's misogyny, it's woman hating, and it's deliberately trying to erase lesbians, which is, I mean, I love the book, and it was successful. I mean, there were other things as well. I mean, she talks about horizontal hostility. Not sure how I feel about that, except perhaps in all those little separate tents. If you are a marginalized minority within a marginalized minority, you need your separate tent. But when a culture starts to become expected, when BDSM, for example, starts to become so expected, or placating, the trans agenda becomes expected, that's no longer a marginalized minority. That becomes something with which to come down on the people who gave you your home in the first place.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that final chapter about the points of erasure, and she names these different elements of it, doesn't she, as you say, like sexism. And I think it's kind of interesting the way that sexism doesn't have, I don't think the word itself is genteel, but the way that it is used, it doesn't have much impact, because it's used as a bit of a joke. Like, no one would think the word racism is in any way genteel. And, people would take an accusation of racism very seriously in the way that they don't take an accusation of sexism seriously. But so she talks about sexism, and I completely agree that the level of misogyny is so aggressive, so blatant, so vicious. And then she talks about these cycles of conflict. I mean, I think in a way we probably have to remember that she was writing this 5 years ago, or she even earlier than that, because it came out, when was it? Yeah, it came out about 2017, I think, 2016, 2017, yeah. So she was writing it even slightly before that. So I think good for her that she's trying to theorize what are the key points of erasure. But again, I think you could probably just capture all of them in terms of, a patriarchal desire to crush the threat, to dominate and violate. Because what she frames as horizontal hostility, I would totally agree, they're actually elements of masculine culture and male violence that are being brought into the events, or are being used to crush the event from outside, via things like, queer politics, queer theory, that kind of thing. She then goes on to talk about the lack of representation in the sort of traditional historical institutions, which I think is absolutely true, and also what happens as a result of the kind of assimilationist politics of the, so-called LGB, or as it is now, this LGBT movement, and what happens when you achieve these kind of these goals of mainstreaming in what has been, over here it would have been in the past very much associated with the Stonewall organization, the kind of assimilation, gay male assimilationist agenda of equal marriage rights and anti-discrimination legislation, and those kinds of things, at the expense of the very, very different radical lesbian feminist culture that was obviously posing a challenge to heterosexual society, rather than wanting to kind of have a piece of the pie.
She does recognize, though, I mean, she talks about it in that Points of Erasure, that lesbians are not equal beneficiaries of the recent increased tolerance for, and she puts in quotes, LGBT. In women's history, she recently submitted a women's history manuscript and was asked, but are you going to include men? Even in our lesbian gay cultures, the dual queering and assimilation of the past 2 decades has been a very patriarchal creep, erasing and minimizing the two women together image that I love in favor of an alphabet soup community skewing male. So, I mean, she obviously recognizes and has compassion, and understands the reality of what's happening to lesbian community and to lesbians. She does make reference to transing women, lesbians, especially so-called butch lesbians, as part of that patriarchal creep, which is I guess a way of saying misogyny. And she does make a point at the end that the more lesbians insist on their own issues as women and claim spaces of their own to address those issues, it's perceived of as transphobia. And it isn't. I mean, it's really just sort of, I mean, all women wanted to do at Mishfest was to turn away from Camp Trans, to turn away from that, just to ignore them and have one space for 1 week a year to only look at each other, to only be with other women, especially, I mean, particularly for lesbians. I mean, the there's such there was such a hostility for a long time towards the older 1960s 1970s lesbians. I'm starting to see a little bit I'm starting to see that recede a little bit as younger lesbians come up and find that there's no way to meet each other, and us oldsters get asked, what was it like? I mean, what was it like to really, be able to go to a bar every night and interact with 100 different women, 100 different lesbians every night with no men around? What was it like? What was it like? What was it like? And that's part of what Bonnie Morris has done, is to tell us this is what it was like. And that, women read that, it's like, this is what it was like. It's a lived experience that's not subjective. It's a lived experience that's documented. That was very real. And I commend her for that.
Yeah, I've realized we've only got a few minutes left, so I also want to at least kind of point towards some of the ongoing projects and sort of enterprises of lesbian culture that we see. I want to be quite careful about doing that, because obviously this is going to go up on YouTube, and these spaces are constantly under serious threat. But just to say that, in terms of some of the music festivals, I don't know if women are aware, there are still ongoing events that are happening in relation to some of those spaces, and you can certainly look into that. But I just want to not commit to further active erasure by not mentioning those, because I think that's been really fantastic, the way that some of the women who were involved with festivals like Mishfest have been actually really taking up the reins, given that there was the last festival back in 2015. So there's that. There are still other lesbian spaces. Again, I just want to be a bit careful about how much I say, because that's the danger. She talks about the role of the internet, doesn't she? And that is kind of the danger. It can be used to communicate between ourselves, but also it can be used to very destructive ends. But I wouldn't want to just give a totally kind of, I wouldn't want to participate in erasure by not mentioning those. And certainly I
want to make a pitch for the telephone. I mean, we used to do it that way, and nobody can read what you say on the telephone. I mean, I'm old, so we used, we will have to do again what we did when I first came in. I met all these older lesbians, who came out in the 40s and 50s. I mean, the first lesbians I ever met was that I happened to walk into a meeting or a gathering place for Daughters of Bilitis in Greenwich Village. And I was like 13 years old, and that's how I found out. And they, and I got to know them, and they told me what it was like. And they met in private. They had to meet in private houses. They had to meet in private spaces. It was by invitation only. And it's very hard to meet people that way. And this was in a concentrated place in New York City. But still, that's what they had to do. And that's what, when lesbians meet now, free of men, that's how we have to do it now. Which is why it's important not to say that there are some women only festivals, that there are women only gatherings. It's in private, and just do it. If you're, find women anywhere near you, and have potlucks again. Remember potlucks. I mean, do all this stuff again in private, because
Yeah, and there are things out, there are events and things out there that you'll be able to find, but it just really is very much kind of underground again, isn't it? Marian, just hearing you say that, have you written any of this down? Because you're a great repository yourself of some of the experiences that you had back from those early days. I think it would be a fantastic contribution to the archives. Have you thought about, I don't know if you've written this stuff down, or have you thought about publishing?
I'm not much of a writer.
Well, maybe just dictate it then, and why don't you have a podcast? That's what everyone's doing.
I'm a scientist. I'm a scientist. I do equations. I mean,
we'll have to do more specific interviews with you, I think, about your experiences and your memories, because I think you've got a great repository there of experience and knowledge that is really precious. I'm really sorry. Once again, I have not much. Sorry, I haven't paid. I can never pay attention to the chat as well. So I'm sure we've missed all kinds of interesting comments.
We're 1 minute over. Oh no.
Yeah, so but anyway, I heartily recommend this book. I was actually, when we were planning the session, I was actually a bit worried that I wouldn't be able to speak without crying, because it's just so moving, and I have to say it's absolutely heartbreaking. The viciousness of the attacks on such a beautiful beautiful culture is just absolutely terrible. But anyway, I've managed to get through it without
I mean, there are things, some of that early music that I can't hardly listen to anymore, because it makes me weep for what we had and what we lost.
Well, it's a lot of it is still there. If you have a little look on YouTube, you can find a lot of the Mishfest playlists. You can find a lot of the Chris Williams and the Meg Christian, these different ones, Nidra Johnson, you can find a lot of these fantastic.
I have the original vinyl albums.
I'm not saying for you, I know you do, but I'm saying for other women who may not be aware that there's still a lot around, and I think, just to give another little plug, I think the book of poetry that Bonnie Morris has published, I think that's going to be something really special. So I'm definitely going to be ordering that. So I think we're gonna close it there. Marian, thank you. I really enjoyed talking about this book with you.
Always great to talk with you, Julia.
Yeah, you too. Okay, thanks everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.